Oh, you know. Good evening, Dave. Good evening, Kayla Gittel. I'm just sharing it in a few places and we'll be rolling momentarily. Good evening, Yaakov. Good evening, Ruth. And we got it on Facebook. Oh, you know. It's now on YouTube. So we got that covered. Give people a moment to join. L'chaim, Kela Gittel. Good evening, Rivka. Good evening, Jane. Look at that. We waited for you just to get here. And we're going to get rolling. Okay. Let's make sure no one else is trying to come in here on Zoom. Very good. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just came barging in from Big Sky. I went to visit a Jewish buddy in Big Sky, and there was some construction. So I just arrived. But boy, do we have a subject to discuss tonight in the Parsha. So this week is a double Torah portion. It's Matos and Maseh, the last two portions in the book of Numbers and the book of Bamidbar. And I'm taking you straight to the seventh reading on page 1028. And we're actually going to do something we don't normally do, which is we're going to read a little bit more than we usually do straight from the verses. And this way it'll give us a better context of what we're addressing. So the Jews are getting closer to the land of Israel. They're getting instructions of how that's going to go down. And we have this moment here where, actually, as I said the seventh reading, I apologize, 1027, the sixth reading. It says, Reuven and Gad's descendants had a lot of livestock, an extraordinarily large amount. They saw the land of Yazer and the land of Gilad, and it was clearly a suitable place for livestock. So of the 12 tribes, the tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuven had a lot of livestock. Actually, some of the commentators, I think it was Rabbi Yonis and Eibshitz, said that the reason they had so much livestock is because they, in the desert, instead of using their livestock to make barbecues and to enjoy ribeyes, they focused their time on enjoying the manna from heaven. So they chose to eat manna. They chose for all of their sustenance to come from the manna, and therefore they had a lot more livestock by the time it came time to cross into Israel. So they had all this livestock. So it says that God's descendants and Reuben's descendants came and spoke to Moses and to Elazar the priest, right? Because Aaron had passed away already. So to Moses and the high priest, which was Elazar, Aaron's son, and to the leaders of the community. And they said, listen, the lands of Atarot and Divon and Yazer and Nimra and Cheshbon and Elale and Svam and Nevoy and Baon, the land which God defeated in front of the congregation of Israel, is a land suitable for livestock, and your servants have a lot of livestock. And therefore, if it finds favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as a heritage. Do not take us across the Jordan. So here you have two tribes who seemingly were obsessed with manna from heaven, meaning these were spiritual people. They chose manna over barbecues. And yet, is it frozen, it says? Oh, yeah. Can you see me, Ruth? So it must be a Facebook issue. I don't know. Is it better? Let me lower the. I don't know if there's anything to do with it, but just for some clarity. Please let me know if it's frozen. I have no way to control. I mean, I don't see any issue here. Jane, let me know in the comments if it's working. It says better, but I want to make sure that it's actually working. You see, Zoom is fine, right? I don't think it's a Wi-Fi issue. If Zoom is fine, it might just be a Facebook issue. Can anyone on Facebook comment if you see me, if this is working? There's no way for me to know otherwise. Okay. So maybe it's not on Facebook. I apologize. Maybe maybe something's going on in Illinois. So they come to Moshe, they come to Moses, and they say to Moses and Elazar, and they say they want to stay in the Transjordan. They want to stay on the east side of the Jordan. And for lack of a better term, Moshe flips out. Here we go again. Here we go again. They don't want to go into Israel. Didn't we just have this with the spies 38 years earlier, where the spies didn't want to go into the land of Israel? Haven't the Jews learned anything about not going into the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And he quotes and he tells them the whole story over, that Caleb and Yefunah, that Caleb and Joshua, the son of Nun, Yoshua, they're the only ones that followed. And then he says something really pretty tough. He says, quote, God became angry with Israel and he made them wander in the desert for 40 years until the entire generation who acted wrongly in God's eyes had passed on. And what does God say? What does Moshe say? You've just now protested in the same way as your fathers. What a group of wicked men who are further inciting God's anger against Israel. And if there was ever a classic biblical event where people were misunderstood, this was it. Moses naturally was concerned that, oh my gosh, here we go again. But he totally misunderstood the tribe of Reuven and the tribe of Gad, because instead of them they said to him, hello. Vayikshu Elav, they approached him, Moses, and they said, we'll build sheep enclosures. We'll make place for our family and for our animals, and we will go. We will then arm ourselves quickly, and we will be the first ones to march into the land of Canaan and transform it from Canaan into Israel. We will be the leaders to conquer the land of Israel. We're not trying to get out of the war. We won't even come back to our families and to our livestock until the war is done. Until every Jew inherits their portion in the west side of the Jordan River, we won't come back. But long term, we'd like to stay on this side because it's more convenient and more suitable for the amount of livestock we have. When Moshe heard that, when Moses heard that, he backed off. He realized he wasn't dealing with rebels like the spies. He wasn't dealing with troublemakers. So he allowed them to do it. That's exactly what they ended up doing. And eventually they settled in the land of Sichon and Og, which was, again, the two nations that we read about earlier in the book of Numbers, who messed with the Jews, didn't let us go through their land, and we took them out. We took out the two giants, Sichon and Og, and their nations, which, by the way, was land that they had conquered from the Ammonites and the Moabites. And for all eternity, the tribe of Reuven and Gad, as well as half of the tribe of Manasseh, which joined later, had their primary residence, had their real estate in the Transjordan, not west of the Jordan. By the way, I should make just for clarity, when you hear the Jew lovers around the world use terms like the West Bank, which is a word that I don't recognize. I mean, if you study the Torah, there is no such term. There's something called Judea and Samaria, which is part of Israel, always was, always will be. But they say West Bank. West Bank of where? Most people in America, even the ones that are screaming about Israel's rights and lack of rights and whatever, apartheid, all the Bubba-Mises, all the stories they try to sell us in the media. West Bank of what? It's the West Bank of the Jordan River, which obviously belongs to the Jews because God gave it to us. It's right here for the 75th time in the 5 books of Moses. What's fascinating is that Reuven and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh, their real estate was on the east side of the Jordan, the river. So Transjordan, what you would call today Jordan. So my recommendation is people should stop complaining about the West Bank, because really the East Bank belongs to us too. And if I had my way, I'd like to have it back. It belongs to me. I mean, personally, I don't know if I'm from Reuven or Gad or half of Manasseh. I don't know exactly which tribe I'm from. But if it's not me, someone in my shul comes from that tribe, and therefore they should be able to go back and get their inheritance. That's just my commercial message. That was my advertisement for the United Nations on behalf of the Jewish people of Montana. Now, I'd like to address this whole episode with Moses and these two tribes and the misunderstanding that Moshe had and how eventually he comes to terms and understands that they're not like the spies. But we need to understand that from a deeper perspective, not because it isn't understood, but because people like Moshe Rabbeinu, people like Moses, people like the tribes of Reuven and Gad should have had a better ability to express themselves, to verbally express themselves in a way that people understood them. And yet there was a total disconnect to the point that there's a full page in this week's Torah portion, one of this week's 2 Torah portions, literally Moshe lambasting them for even trying to say something that sounds like the spies. How did he misunderstand them that much? You have a question? So what I'm going to share with you tonight is an incredible insight from the Rebbe of Blessed Memory, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that he shared primarily in a talk in 1990. So actually it's one of the later talks that the Rebbe shared. The Rebbe had suffered a massive stroke in March of 1992 when I was 10 years old, and passed away from complications of that stroke and another stroke that followed in 1994. But 1990, especially the summer of 1990, was a year and a half before the Rebbe stopped talking. And therefore, this is one of the last matos masei farbrengens about this week's parsha that the Rebbe addressed when he was able to. And the Rebbe begins with a question. What were the tribes of Reuven and Gad thinking in the first place, asking to settle down on the east side of the Jordan against God's will? Forget about the spies for a minute. Let's forget about Moses' issues, all right? Just from their perspective, God says, I want the Jews to go conquer the land of Canaan. They come along and say, not Canaan. We want to be outside of Canaan, outside of the Canaanite land. We want to be on the east side of the Jordan. So indeed, how is that different than the spies? They didn't want to go into Israel. The spies, right? The spies wanted to stay in the desert. And so did the tribes of Manasseh and the tribe of Gad and Reuven. So let's forget about the conversation with Moses for a minute. What were they thinking to stand up and say, hey, Moshe, we'd like to stay outside of Eretz Canaan, outside of the land of Canaan, which would become the land of Israel? And furthermore, not only did they have the chutzpah to ask for it, Moses agreed. Yeah, sure, Moses spent the whole page of the Chumash arguing with them in the beginning. But when they explained their position, on some level, he surrendered and said, okay, it makes sense, you could stay here. As long as you go to war, as long as you go to war. What about the fact that God wanted all the Jews from the desert to go into the land of Israel? How did that suddenly shift? And indeed, why is that not the exact same thing that the spies try to do? Of course, a different venue, a different setup, a different scenario, but the bottom line was the same. We don't want to go into the land of Israel. And the tribes of Gad and Reuven said the same thing. And somehow Moshe agreed. Think of any other biblical event where God says, go there. And they said, we prefer not going there. How about we go here? And Moses would say, sure, no problem. Makes no sense. So if you see it even from a biblically superficial perspective, something's missing here. Comes along the Rebbe in his one of a kind. There is none like him in his unique approach to the Torah and to the fusion of Hasidic thought, of Jewish mysticism, esoteric teachings of the Torah, as it's fused together with the exoteric, with the revealed parts of the Talmud and the Medrash. And the Rebbe says as follows. Not only were the tribes of Gad and Reuven not comparable to the spies, their actions actually were a rectification for what the spies did. So again, they both asked to stay out of Israel, and yet the second group was a rectification for the first group, and the Rebbe explained it as follows. There's a concept in the laws of tshuva. It's an interesting thing, by the way, because people always talk about how do you know if you repented, if you did tshuva, if you're actually a changed person, or you're just someone who thinks they're changed until another opportunity comes to sin. And as one Jew told me today on a call, Rabbi, I'm one of the sinful ones. So how do you know if you're one of the sinful ones that have tried to change your ways, if you actually have changed your ways? So the Rambam says in the Laws of Tshuva, Maimonides, the codifier of Jewish law in the 12th century, says total tshuva, complete repentance, is when you have an opportunity to do the same sin that you transgressed in the past, and you walk away from it and you don't do it. Putting yourself in a bubble where you're not tempted anymore doesn't prove anything. So if you run away from sin to a place where there is no sin, it doesn't mean you've actually repented completely. You got away from sin. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't completely change anything until you're in a similar situation and you're able to restrain yourself and refrain from the sin and walk away. Now you know you've done tshuva. In a similar note, the only way to truly rectify the mistake of the spies who despised Israel, for whatever reason, you could talk about it from the most spiritual perspective. The bottom line is they did not want to enter the land of Israel. And the only way to rectify that is to put the Jews in a similar situation, which seems so similar to what actually happened with the spies, except it's a totally positive thing. And here's where the Rebbe goes with it. And it makes sense because it makes sense that the Rebbe said this in 1990, because it was in those later years, 90, 91, until his stroke in early 1992, that the Rebbe was really, in Yiddish we call it shturming. The Rebbe was on fire about our fervent hope and prayer and belief that Mashiach should come ASAP. And so it's not shocking to me that in 1990 the Rebbe would address this perspective, this story, which has been addressed by commentators ad infinitum. You know, it's been discussed myriad of times by every commentator, including the Rebbe and Hasidus, but from a different perspective. And he said as follows: when God promised the land of Israel to Abraham, the founder of the Jewish people, the first Jew, which is again in the book of Genesis and Lech Lecha, he tells him about the inheritance of the land, and God quotes 10 nations, not 7 nations, 10 nations that are that dwell in the promised land and that eventually will be inherited by the Jews. Rashi says right there in Genesis that God only gave 7 of those nations to the Jews when they entered Israel, when they conquered Israel. But the 3 that make up, the 3 final ones that make up the 10, which are the lands of Edom, the Edomites, right? The descendants of Esau, and the Moabites, and the Ammonites, which were both descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham, which are also known in the Torah as Cani, Knizi, and Kadmoni. If you practice those 3 words at home 3 times in front of the mirror, you're guaranteed to butcher it somehow. Cani, Knizi, and Kadmoni. Don't bother. If it's easier for you, you could just say Ammon, Moab, and Edom, if that's easier. Or you could just say the 3 on the other side of the Jordan. But when God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land of Israel, it wasn't just the 7 primary nations, which we say in our prayers every morning, right? The Moiri, etc., the Girgashites and the Hittites and the Canaanites and the Amorites. It wasn't just those. There was 3 additional ones that were not going to be in what we know as today Israel, but on the east side of the Jordan. When would we get those 3 nations? When Mashiach comes. We wouldn't get it fully until Mashiach comes. Now, being that Sichon and Og, the 2 giants that were living in the Transjordan, that were ruling over the Transjordan, who didn't let us come through their land, and we took them out, took over parts of the land that belonged to Ammon and Moab, as Rashi tells us a few weeks ago, quoting from the Talmud, the Talmud in Gittin, that Ammon and Moab we weren't allowed to mess with Ammon and Moab because they were family, but Ammon and Moab were transformed because Sichon and Og took them over. So now comes along the descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuven, and they say, hey, we want to move this process of conquering the land of Israel, not just to the normal borders of the land of Israel. We're thinking a lot bigger. We want to start the process of inheriting not only Israel, but the additional 3 nations that are dwelling, that God promised Abraham that we would inherit fully when Mashiach comes. We want to start that process right now by starting to dwell in that land. And there's value in already starting the process, even though it won't come to full fruition until Mashiach comes. So if you think about it, the spies didn't even want to go into the proper land of Israel. The tribes of Gad and Reuven came to Moses, and Moses totally misunderstood them because he assumed if they don't want to go into Israel, they're just like the spies, except they were the total opposite. They wanted to help Moses not only conquer the land of Israel proper, but extend that to the full land of Israel, which will include parts of Jordan as well. I hope King Abdallah, whatever his name is, in Amman, is listening. Maybe his people are listening. Everyone thinks the Russians are listening all the time. I hope the Jordanians are listening today, because that east side of the Jordan, literally in our Torah portion, not only will become ours when Mashiach comes, but was already the process of conquering and taking ownership of that land already existed when the tribe of Gad and Reuven came to rectify the spies' issues and bring about a completion of the inheritance of all of the lands that God promised to Abraham. You have a question? You keep putting it in your eye. I keep thinking you have some brilliant thing coming to mind.
Think of thoughts.
You can keep what you think. We don't want to think of thoughts. So when you think about the spies wanted to stay in the desert so they can be all spiritual. They didn't want to work in the physical part of the land, right? That was their spirit. And so they made a big mistake because God doesn't want us to be separated from the world. He wants us to purify and sanctify and elevate and transform the physical world, the unholy parts of the world, and make it holy. And here's where it gets a little subtle, where it's such a nuanced approach. You gotta pay close attention now. The tribes of Gad and Reuven also didn't want to go into the land of Israel. Right? They didn't want to be busy with all the agricultural work and the hard labor. They wanted to be able to serve God without any extra obsessions or addictions to physicality and materialism. So in that sense, they were similar to the spies. But what did the spies do? Look back at the story in Parsha Shlach, a few weeks, 5-6 weeks ago, whenever it was. The spies came. They didn't say, hey, Moses, can you do me a favor? Can you maybe let the 12 of us or the 10 of us, because remember, Caleb and Joshua were okay. Could you let the 10 of us stay in the desert and the rest of the Jews can go to Israel? It's too physical for us. It's beyond the scope of what we feel capable of doing. So God said we can take over Israel. We believe that, we see it, but we think we need to stay on, outside of it because we need to be in a more spiritual, tranquil place. Had they done that, perhaps the story wouldn't be the same. They didn't do that. They took their agenda and their issues with how engrossed you would be in the physical and the material, and they said none of us should go to Israel. Israel's a bad, bad place. Gad and Reuven actually came and they said, no. We know that God wants us to transform the world. The only way to transform the world is to deal with physical and deal with material and deal with the mundane and deal with the challenges and deal with the struggles and deal with the darkness and deal with the unholiness. So we're not trying to stop the Jews from going to Israel. We think all the Jews should go to Israel. We have a request if we could be exempt. We don't want to be exempt because we're copping out, but we believe that if some Jews remain in a spiritual state, able to give spiritual energy to the people as a whole, so that they will have what it takes to actually work the land, we will all be better off. In other words, let's split the duties. We want Israel to be conquered. We want all of Israel, including the 3 nations on the east side of the Jordan, to be conquered. We want God's promise to Abraham of 10 nations being inherited by the Jews, not to wait until Mashiach comes, but to start the process now. But every nation needs the people that support it. Every army needs that. No army can operate if everyone's on the front line shooting, or whatever people do in their army. I've never been, so I don't know. I'm assuming it's shooting. You need to have people in central command guiding. You need to have people that are giving the logistics. You need to have people that are working in reconnaissance. You need to have people doing all different things to make an army work. And what they were telling Moshe is that we believe in Israel big time, but we want it to succeed. And the only way it can succeed in our mind is if a minority, a small group of us stays in Transjordan, remains spiritually intact or spiritually immersed, so that we can be spiritually in tune and bring spiritual, because we're one organism as a nation, bring spiritual support and bring spiritual energy so that everyone else can fulfill their mission interacting with the world. Like today in Israel, they have all these big debates. Who goes to the army and who doesn't? Why do these lazy bums not go to the army? And I'm obviously saying lazy bums in quotation marks. And why do they have to sit and learn Torah? Why don't they put on their uniform and get out? Because for Jews to survive, we need a good army. That's the physical side. We also need incredible spiritual energies to keep us supported spiritually. And without Torah, without mitzvahs, without the vitality of Judaism and Jewish spirituality, no army will succeed. Just like without an army, no one will be able to learn Torah in Israel. Without Torah, no one will be able to fight in their army. You need both. Now, we can have a good discussion about whether it should be a minority, whether everyone claiming to be a Torah scholar when they're really just selling falafel should be included in it. There's good discussions to be had. I've been to yeshivas, so no one could argue with me. I know how many of the students that sit around are learning and how many of them are discussing the weather and politics and their next trip when they have a Shabbos off. But there are sincere Torah scholars, many of them. And they are the ones, through their Torah scholarship and their devotion to Torah study and the observance of mitzvahs, to a fault, that they are the ones that are giving the vitality to our people so that that army could succeed and that the nation could thrive. And to think you could do it without them is a ridiculousness that even Ben Gurion, who was not necessarily very religious, or should I say necessarily not very observant in his Yiddishkeit, understood that you need to have the Torah scholars. And what Gad and Reuven were saying is, no, we love Israel. We want Israel. We want to expand Israel across the Jordan. But we also understand that every nation needs its spiritual force, and we want to be that spiritual force. And we think we're pretty suited for that. And you got to give them credit for having that self-assessment, self-awareness, and say, we think we're the right ones for that. And Moshe accepted it. And through that, they actually brought rectification to the sin of the spies, because it seemed so similar to what the spies had done, but what actually was quite the opposite. And that's why it's so important when we study Torah to look at the deeper story. What's really going on? Because otherwise it sounds like a bunch of cowards. And even if they were ready to go to war, but why should my children have to go across and to fight the 7 nations, and your children get to stay in the Transjordan? Your animals, your cattle, your flock, your sheep that stay on the Transjordan, you're a coward. Let's call a spade a spade. Gad and Reuven, you're cowards. But it was the exact opposite. They were those amazing Jews that live in Hebron? The most amazing people you'll ever meet in your life are the Jews that live in Hebron. We're not going to... Literally, you'll go to... If you've never been to Israel, you need to go. And if you've been to Israel, you've never been to Hebron, you got to meet these souls. They are the biggest troopers you'll ever meet in the world. They're kind, they're happy, and they're settling the land with their sweat and toil right near the graves of our patriarchs and matriarchs. They're the best. They're the best of the land, because their love for Israel is unbeatable. It's like the love that Moses had for Israel. And I share that because I think Gad and Reuven were exactly that. They were what the UN would call settlers. You know those settlers that live in the West Bank? So these were the settlers on the East Bank. But they were the salt of the earth. They were the beauty of our people. Because not only did they see the bigger promise to Abraham in expanding the total land of Israel, they also recognized that in order for the land to succeed, you need some troopers willing to be the spiritual vitality for our nation. And honestly, as we find ourselves now in the 3 weeks, almost in the 9 days, Friday will be Rosh Chodesh, and we'll usher in the month of Av, the 9 days of mourning leading to Tisha B'Av, to the 9th of Av, when we commemorated so many levels of destruction that took place for our temples and our people. It's a time to reflect on who we are. What is our yearning? What is our love? How many days do we wake up and say, oh, I can't wait to retire in the Hamptons, or I can't wait to retire in Maui, or I can't wait to retire in Cabo, instead of saying, I can't wait for Mashiach to come so I could be in Yerushalayim. If we had a love for Israel, if we had a drive for Israel the way Gad and Reuven did, and we had a love for our people the way Gad and Reuven did, and we recognition of the organism that is our people, the oneness of this organism, we wake up every day on fire for God, on fire for our people, and on fire for the land of Israel. So if you wake up tomorrow morning and you don't feel like you're on fire, you feel like, who cares about Israel? Too much, it's too political. It's too complicated. There's two sides to every story. Whatever one-liner you make up. Or if you get up and you're tired of your people, Jews are making you crazy and you're tired of them. There's nothing wrong with our people, there's nothing wrong with the land, there's nothing wrong with our Torah, there's something wrong with you. Right? The famous Talmudic statement, if you feel empty, it's from you. Don't feel empty. Meditate, contemplate on the beauty of our land that God gave us, the expanded land, the way God and Reuven saw it. Contemplate on the beauty of our people who are made up of all different kinds, and we are diverse. Some people are the spiritual force, some people are the practical force, but we're all part of the same organism, and celebrate that. Don't allow the naysayers to make you despise your own people or your own land or your own religion, our beautiful Torah. And if God, for whatever God-forsaken reason, you wake up and feel yuck about the Jews or about Israel, you got to fix that. And the way to fix it is to go reread the story of Gad and Reuven and how much they loved their people and their land and the expanded land. And maybe that will be the energizer bunny, that will be the inspiration to you to do the same. Stop judging your brothers and sisters. Stop judging the land of Israel. Everyone has opinions about Israel. I never heard anyone have opinions about Micronesia. Never heard anyone have opinions about, I never heard two people sitting on a plane discussing if Greece really should be in control of part of Cyprus and Turkey and the other part, North Cyprus. No one's bothered by it. Israel, a whole day we babble, and Jews are the biggest babblers. Stop doing that. Be Gad, Reuven, and eventually the half a tribe of Manasseh. Love your land, love your people. Don't surrender. Don't sell yourself because some guy made you uncomfortable and asked you about the West Bank. Be a proud Jew, a proud lover of Israel, and God willing, we will merit before Tisha B'Av, like Gad and Reuven, to have the expanded experience of the land of Israel with a temple on the Temple Mount. The coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, our righteous, beloved Redeemer, Mashiach, may be speedy in our days, and we could all say, Amen. Have a rockin' rest of the week. Remember again, Friday begins, Thursday night begins Rosh Chodesh, 9 days of mourning. We don't mourn on Shabbos, so there's no mourning on Shabbos, but during the 9 days, we refrain from eating any poultry and meat. We refrain from listening to any music. We refrain from overbathing ourselves. No jacuzzis and no hot tubs in the middle of the 9 days. It's a time of mourning. And we'll merit, if we mourn properly, even Napoleon knew this, that the people that know how to mourn properly also know how to party properly and celebrate properly. God willing, that celebration, that joy, the Simchas Olam Al Roshim, the great joy on their head will be with the coming of Mashiach. No more secondary joys, no more backup joys, the ultimate joy. Have a rocking evening, and we'll see you back here, God willing, if the sun is shining next week. Even if the sun is not shining, we'll be back here next week. Zay gesund.
Everybody go to summer.
Chalila. You're not allowed to even, hold on.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Second.
We are live. I'll give everyone a moment to join.
Never delete.
And,
Good, we're done. Ruth, we're good?
Yes, we're good, and I'm going to get back to you about the dogs after the holidays.
You know where to find me.
Beg your pardon?
Then you know where to find me.
Yeah, because I haven't been able to get all my questions answered about Shabbos. So.
No problem. Shoot it over and I'll do my best to help.